action this evening. A mystery, so it seems. Who do you imagine confronting for our fee-increasing schemes? Could it be the bearded lady, Richard Bloom, who invests in internet spending, which working-class students will have to attend after UC privatization, i.e. ITT Tech? He wants all our academic debt. Pay attention.
Or could you be the 500-pound woman, Mark Udoff, that deserves $1 million salaries in a recession, or more to renovate his mansion? He's the original that's seen our fees and enhanced.
Alright, we're talking to Leo here about socioeconomic segregation. So, the question is, how has socioeconomic segregation and the K-12 public education system affected the representation of minorities in the university, in this state particularly?
Well, the fact is most underrepresented minorities in the UC system come from underfunded, if not absolutely no funding, almost, going to these inner city schools, right. And then there's no after-school retention programs. I mean, much of the time I'm from Los Angeles, right? So in my middle and high school, they bust out students from South Central and East LA because they got more money from the state the more brown students they had, right? In these predominantly white neighborhoods. Right. The problem is these students had to wake up at 4:30 in the morning to do this. Then you wonder why they didn't do so good on standardized testing, because maybe an extra 2 hours or so or sleep would have made that difference, let alone the fact that, for the most part, AP programs at most schools, there's actually been studies that show that the more APs a high school offers, the less representation of minorities there is at that school, let alone ability for minorities to be able to get into that school. And it also unfairly favors the economically endowed, in that if you can afford to take these AP tests, and they say that they can waive the scholarship, etc., all these other things, you actually don't have to stay in college as long as other people, because it covers certain classes. You don't have to pay as much tuition as others might, or others might have to take out more loans to pay this tuition, right? So these are a bunch of sock puppets made by elementary school students from Mountain Elementary, and I told them the exercise was like, what do you want to be when you grow up, right? How can an education help you get there? A lot of these students are saying education is important because it teaches you science and math, which you need. For example, if the president did not go to school, it would be really bad for a lot of people. I think they're onto something right there.
Usually areas where undocumented students or minority students are living at, they tend to suffer from a bad education because they can't afford to privately invest in their own schools, right? And or fundraise for their schools, and it just makes it overall harder to get into a university, and which limits the representation of those students.
I think it was really significant because a lot of the segregation was done based on language. So a lot of the people that didn't speak English, that were barely learning it, were segregated into separate classes, such as, like, let's say ELD classes, or maybe when they were in elementary school, they were segregated in different. They were taken away from classes and put into a separate area just to learn the language. Right. And I know some schools do tracking systems where specific students who are barely learning English are only giving the classes that are like wood shop and like home So they aren't giving college preparatory classes. Yeah, so it's really they're giving less opportunities to go to college, less information about it because it's assumed that they're not going to make it since they have the language barriers.
So what wonderful clowns we have, scooting around in their little seats told to sit and speak packed in classes by the dozen while we cut the total by 11%, that is.
Well, I would say that definitely with the No Child Left Behind Act, we had like a rapid shift in the way that public education was performed, and so you went from, instead of having people who, like, on a need basis, people getting public education, what you ended up doing is doing standardized testing. And so like that affects people of color in a lot of ways, because if you're used to standardized testing, then you can be good at it even if you don't know the material. And so people who are actually familiar with the material don't necessarily score as well. Which I think just means that like what we're teaching kids nowadays is more testing skills and less like critical thinking and knowledge. And I think that's can be like, that can very much affect people of color and segregation, and that the people who don't test well get less funding so that they test even worse in the future, which is just like it's
kind
just
of like an endless.
Yeah, it's a self-defeating like prophecy. It's just like if you don't test well, then that means you're just going to always not test well. There's that. Then there's like a big thing is just the end of like public education. I mean, we reached this point where like if you do well, the original idea of public education was that if you were in the top 10% of your class, you got to go to college, and now they don't. The UC doesn't even care about people in their own state. They want out-of-state people, which is like because they can afford to pay higher rates, and that's just going to affect. I mean, that's going to affect people of color drastically. Because I mean, like now we effectively have less college opportunities. Even if we did as well, someone who can afford more is going to get picked over us. It's effectively the opposite of what's we call it affirmative action. It's like reverse affirmative action.
That has been shut down on lockdown 6 times in 2007 for shootings in the area, and these are little children. There's a class of 46 fifth graders and 38 kindergartners. You can imagine the quality of their education will not bring them to this institution or any institution of higher education. It's them who really need the mobilization in a day of
There are so many different levels to take it, and there's so many different aspects of how class and race affect representation within the higher education institutions. First thing that come to mind, I like to bring up personal stories. My mother is a teacher in West Oakland in a public school, and she teaches 2nd grade. And every public education has been highly affected by testing, as we all know. And so part of the prep work for her testing is like language, and her class is 95% Chicano Latino, and in the class, 95%, yes. And in the SAT, or not SAT, but they call it STAR testing, one of the questions in terms of what the vocabulary words are is, what is a chandelier? And this is a really low income area within West Oakland. So what is a chandelier? What is a yacht was one of them. Now a child in Orinda might own a yacht, whereas a child in West Oakland has never even heard that term before. Another question that brought up a lot of, that relates directly to socioeconomic class, one of the questions is why is recycling important? The A and B were like bullshit answers, and then B, D, and C. D was for my family to get money, and C was about saving the planet. Now, when I was growing up, we recycled for money, but the question is obviously going to be about what is it's for the environment. So that's a direct relationship between socioeconomic class and the way testing is biased. People don't.
Biased, exactly. So, well, standardized testing, how does that really, truly, in the outcome, what's the outcome of that when people get low scores and stuff like that? What does this mean for the schools that they have unfair standardized testing?
Well, the way California and most of the nation is set up is the school gets funding based on the quality of the standardized tests, and standardized testing is used to get into higher education. We see that with the SATs, and they're a requirement. Right. And also in general, in classes, you need to do well on your tests, but those don't measure all the different types of learning styles, and they have very culturally and economic biases within them, which hinder people from being able to attend universities like this from ages of second grade all the way on up. Another huge issue in the way that socioeconomic class and race affect representation within the university and education in general is when you come from a low-income background, you go to a low-income school, under-resourced school. So from the get-go, you are a step behind students who are tracked into education. And within those schools, there are a lot of policies such as large representation of police on campus, unfair suspension practices that funnel students students of color in particular, into detention, into juvenile halls, and therefore into prison and not into college. We call it the school-to-prison pipeline, which gets low-income students into prison and not college.